I spent my childhood growing up on an island called Bermuda. And back then, there was this cool thing where everyone on the island got the whole day off to celebrate. What? Why? Because it was the Queen's birthday. Pop quiz. What is the name of the Queen of England who reigned for 70 years from 1952 to 2022? Think about it. But not too long. If you said Elizabeth II, that's right. Yeah, that was easy. Let's try another one more up your alley. Name one of your state senators. What? You have to Google it. Yeah, listen, we Americans may be a little obsessed with the monarchy. From Disney princesses to Game of Thrones, our entertainment is filled with stories of kings and queens. Here's the catch. If we are all this obsessed with absolute monarchies and virtuous kings, then why did the framers write an entire constitution to make sure we'd never have a king here? It's civic literacy time, and this is your host, Mercedes Musto, in the studio today with Dr. Jacob Shively. Did you check out our U.S. Constitution preambles conversations? Yeah, the We the People one. That's when Dr. Shively told the famous story from the final days of the Constitutional Convention in 1787.
It really is a perfect story, and if you'll give me a moment, I'd love to talk about it. Politicians and commentators love to repeat it. Textbooks have been named after it. Of course, to be clear, there is some dispute about whether this story actually happened, but honestly, if you ask me, the story is so good that whether it is completely accurate hardly matters. Anyway, the account comes down to us from the journal of a delegate to the Constitutional Convention, a man named James McHenry. After deliberating for months behind closed doors, the delegates finally were emerging in mid-September 1787. The Articles of Confederation had been in place for a decade, but everyone knew that system had to be updated. It just wasn't working. So back in Philadelphia, people had been milling around the meeting house, listening at the windows, trying to get some hint of the result. Finally, the delegates were ready to talk. According to McHenry, a Mrs. Powell of Philadelphia, and here I'm directly quoting his journal, asked Dr. Benjamin Franklin, "Well, doctor, what have we got, a republic or a monarchy?" "A republic," replied the doctor, "if you can keep it."
What? Whoa. That single quote sums up exactly why we are here today. What was Franklin talking about? Today, all emotions aside, we're going to explain exactly what Franklin meant. We'll cover where our political ideas come from, why the United States is structured the way it is, and a crucial distinction that trips up a ton of students on exam day: the difference between a pure democracy and a constitutional republic. Let's get started. Concept 1, the U.S. Constitution, the Guarantee Clause. Imagine you wake up tomorrow and a rogue group has taken over your state government, thrown out the governor, and declared an absolute dictatorship. What? Can they do that? According to our U.S. Constitution, the answer is a hard no. Whew, gosh. I nearly scared myself there. Let's look at Article 4, Section 4. You will find what historians call the Guarantee Clause. It explicitly states, quote, "The United States shall guarantee to every state in this union a republican form of government, and shall protect each of them against invasion, and on application of the legislature or of the executive, when the legislature cannot be convened, against domestic violence." End quote. That's right, I said republican form of government, but I'm not talking about red and blue parties here. I'm talking about systems of governing in our American way of doing things. Hold up. Yes. Yes, I said our way of doing things. Our way compared to what? Well, I mean, compared to, let's say, a monarchy or a dictatorship. Yikes. Dr. Shively, let's understand together. some common forms of government?
Sure. A lot of political scientists divide modern governments into a few big categories. These are usually the answer to two simple questions. One, who rules? And two, how much power do those hold in their hands when they're ruling? Now, of course, the category that we know best is democracy. By that, we usually mean any system that includes public participation. The people rule in some form or another. There is a lot of variation here, but this almost always means electing leaders, allowing free speech, and forming political parties. Okay, another familiar category is authoritarianism. This is a very broad category, but it usually means that a leader or the military or a single political party, like in your scenario just a moment ago, is the one who holds the ultimate power. These are actually fairly common around the world today, or sometimes we'll have what's called a mixed authoritarianism, where they have some elements of democracy, some elements of authoritarianism. Monarchies and theocracies are probably something you've definitely heard of, and these might also fit, I think, in this authoritarian category. In a monarchy, of course, political power is inherited down through a family. You might also have an aristocracy of rich people basically supporting the monarch. And then in a theocracy, the religious institutions and religious leaders run the country. Okay, so I've got one more category here, and then we'll move on. But believe it or not, authoritarian systems still have some constraints on their power, particularly over culture and society. Totalitarian systems, which you may have also heard about, aim to control every aspect of your life. These have been somewhat rare simply because that level of control is hard to achieve and to maintain. But you could look at North Korea today as an example of this. Now, each of these could be modified by ideologies that I'm sure you've heard of, like communism, socialism, capitalism, and similar ones. But all that is probably a discussion for a different podcast. Now, I'll say one other thing here. The ancient Greeks had a whole system of categories as well. I won't get into that, but they do overlap a lot with our modern categories. But I think we'll be getting into some of that stuff here in a moment.
That's perfect. That's perfect because you're correct. Concept two, where did our political ideas come from? Now, the founders read what we today call classical texts. They refer back to the ancient Greek and Roman civilizations on systems for governing a body of people. Two for the exam that you may need to know. Number one, from Athens, the founders took the core democratic pulse, meaning the idea that power ultimately belongs to the people. The word democracy, in fact, literally translates to power by the people. But Athenian democracy was a direct democracy, meaning that there were no representatives or branches of government like we have here. For example, in Athens, if a governmental decision was made, that meant that every eligible male citizen basically walked down to the public square, debated the issue, and cast a direct vote. Now let's look at Rome. The founders took the structural idea of a representative system that could be scaled across the entirety of Rome. Naturally, there's more to this, but for the exam, you need to know that ancient Rome looked at the Athenian model and realized it didn't scale. So Rome created a res publica, and that's where we get the word republic. Instead of voting on laws directly like the Athenians, the Roman citizens voted for representatives who made the decisions on their behalf.
Yeah, there's a lot going on here, but let me start with the Roman Empire, which we tend to be really fascinated by today. Picture the Colosseum. Jesus is walking the earth during the Roman Empire. You picture a map of the Romans dominating the entire Mediterranean. It's a very impressive and remarkable culture that really dominated history for a long time. So there are a lot of good reasons why we're interested in the Roman Empire today, but the U.S. founders were actually intrigued by the Roman Republic. There's a key period, a key moment when the Roman Republic transitions to the empire. Now, you'll notice, for example, that many of our government buildings, especially in D.C., have columns, Roman pediments, and all kinds of other architecture that references an ancient and distant society. An ancient Roman would, walking around DC, would feel a little out of place, but they would see a lot of familiar architecture as well. That is not an accident. Most of the men who founded the United States, framed the Constitution, had grown up reading the speeches of Roman statesmen and studying ancient histories that profiled famous Roman leaders. It was just part of their education, sort of like we read about biographies today. But they had come to see that model as relevant to their own experience in politics. Now, I think the key idea here to focus on is citizenship. This might help us translate what's going on with the Romans and the Greeks. For Romans of the Republic or Greeks of an earlier era, the citizen was a free person with property and a stake in the success of the city or the political community. They saw this as someone who would be willing to fight to defend his home. In theory, such a person would be willing to sacrifice for the public good. So you see, they're defining citizen in an important way, someone willing to sacrifice and with a stake in the community, but it's also fairly limited here. Now, a key difference between Romans and Greeks, and you probably don't need to remember too much of this, but it helps maybe give us context, was that the Roman citizenship was open eventually. Elites, aristocrats, and other free men from other cities and regions could become citizens with equal rights. If you know the New Testament in the Bible, Paul the Apostle famously was a Roman citizen. How could that be? He's from a faraway place. Well, the Romans, remarkably for the ancient world, were somewhat flexible in terms of allowing people to become citizens. Now, to be clear, their definition of citizen was far more limited than what modern people would accept. We really are just talking about a subset of men, women, and slaves, who are really a majority of the population put together, would never be considered citizens. And notably, the U.S. founders kind of followed that model. They envisioned male landowners as the electorate. They were a little more flexible and expansive than the Romans, but they still had constraints that we don't have today. Still, the principle of responsible citizenship in a republic, this is key. Citizenship in a republic has proven durable and for many people inspiring, particularly once it was expanded to everyone who was a member of the society or at least a citizen. Now, this idea holds that we have both rights and privileges as a citizen. And I'll repeat that because that's crucial to how the founders were thinking about it. Rights as a citizen and privileges as a citizen, but also duties and responsibilities, right? That's crucial. You have a responsibility along with your rights. We are each responsible for some small piece of the success of the republic under this way of thinking, often through public service, donations, volunteering, studying current issues, and voting in elections, and all those other activities you learn about in civics class. Ancient Romans built their republic to serve an elite aristocracy, I think. That's pretty well established. The U.S. founders were trying to build their republic to reflect a bit of that ethos of service and freedom, but they were ultimately serving a much wider set of people when they were talking about we the people.
This clarifies so much about the beginning ideas of our American governmental systems and where they came from, which really leads into concept 3, democracy versus republic. This brings us to a major target on the FCLE. In casual conversation today, people use the words democracy and republic as if they mean the same exact thing. But on the exam, treating them as identical will cost you some major pass points. So do keep listening. Historically and structurally, they're very different ideas, as Dr. Shively has noted. So let's continue to understand this together. What defines a pure or direct democracy, and what is a constitutional republic?
Now, this is going to sound, and probably sounding to some of you, to be very complicated and abstract, but really, ultimately, it's fairly simple. But give me a moment and we'll try to lay all this out. Now, as a reminder, when we use the word democracy in a very general way, we also might mean it in specific ways. We can mean slightly different things depending on the context. So, to give you an example, growing up as a teenager, We lived in the Midwest, and my parents might say, "We're going to visit Florida." Okay, cool. To me, that might have meant a lot of things. Just going somewhere in the state. Florida might mean just the state of Florida, but it might also mean we're going to Disney or Orlando, or we're going to Pensacola Beach, or we're going to Grandma's house, or it could mean all of those at once, right? So when you say Florida, it can mean a lot of things at once. And that's kind of how democracy works when we talk about it. It means a lot of things. So keep that in mind. When people say democracy, you got to pay attention to the context. Now, in general, remember, any system in which the people actively participate in voting or making decisions about politics and government could be called a form of democracy, rule by the people. Okay, so with that in mind, we've got two ideas we're talking about: direct democracy and constitutional republic. Both are forms of that general category of democracy. Direct democracy means every citizen participates in most or all major decisions. The classic example here is ancient Athens. You'll hear about this all the time. Citizens would gather and vote on major decisions, even for who would be the general in a war. Believe it or not, they even had a machine to randomly select people to serve in certain offices like jurors for trials. You could look it up. It's called a claritarian, but you don't need to know that for the exam. It's just kind of a cool thing I learned about recently. We have some direct democracy today. During elections, we sometimes have what's called a ballot measure. It's a law that voters sometimes themselves are deciding directly and voting on. In Florida, for example, these are fairly common and can actually be used to amend the Florida Constitution. So direct democracy is literally just that. The people are directly making the decisions. All right. Now, next is constitutional republic. This is often how we describe the United States. The two parts of that phrase should be familiar to you by now. A constitution is a written set of rules for the government. In a direct democracy, you can potentially change even how you define individual rights. If you have a constitution, though, the rules of the road are set. It's like a contract. You might be able to change them, but it will be difficult. We already discussed a republic is when you elect people to represent you in government. They are your representatives. Okay, so the logic for all this starts to make sense. Most citizens don't have time to make direct decisions on every policy and every law, and they certainly don't have time to travel from around a vast country to one place, or even around a state, really, to make those decisions. So ideally, the U.S. founders hoped we would elect representatives with respect and moral standing in their communities. And even if they fell short of that ideal, we still have rules and standards to limit the damage. Again, at least in theory. All right, so to summarize, direct democracy is each citizen actively participating in all or most decisions, but the U.S. founders thought that was impractical. Constitutional republic involves citizens electing representatives in a system that is written out and agreed ahead of time.
That really clears up the concepts for me. And I think it does for our listeners too. In fact, it sounds to me like this constitutional republic is a pretty good fit for us Americans. Like it is specifically designed to handle millions of citizens across massive geographical distances while keeping that thing called the tyranny of the majority in check, so to say. What's that? Oh, yeah. Concept number 4. What is tyranny of the majority? If you read the Federalist Papers, I mean, I audiobooked it, just shout out there, especially Federalist Paper number 10, written by James Madison, you quickly realize that the founders were openly terrified of a pure democracy. I mean, this would be a recipe for chaos. Why? Because of two terrifying concepts: the tyranny of the majority and factions.
That's right. In fact, we tend to forget this, but the men at the Constitutional Convention very carefully allowed only one half of one branch of their new government to be directly elected by citizens, the House of Representatives. Supreme Court justices are appointed, presidents are technically elected by the Electoral College, and even senators were to be appointed by their state legislatures rather than elected by the people. That's a lot of buffering against the people. For the U.S. founders, one of the lessons of ancient Greek democracy and philosophy was that the people as a whole will eventually prove capricious and self destructive. That is tyranny of the majority. Now, let's unpack this a little bit. Under this theory, the people, or the demos, will demand more than the government can provide, or they will be mercurial, as we say, and make all kinds of new decisions from one day to the next. It's chaos. At least, again, that's the fear. They might start a war and then change their minds. They will be manipulated by demagogues who make all kinds of promises but are ultimately corrupt and incompetent. So, a democratic Athens, for example, launched a war against Sparta. This is the famous example that everyone would have been thinking about. This war against Sparta ultimately led to the city's near destruction and really the collapse of its democracy. Now, perhaps most directly scary to the men in the Constitutional Convention is that, in their view, the people might also decide to reallocate property from the wealthy. In my view, the U.S. founders found a fairly convenient theory to keep themselves and their fellow elites in their positions. True equality among citizens took decades or even centuries to achieve, but that is a discussion for another day. And by equality, I simply mean, access to voting and so forth. Now, to be fair, the U.S. founders may have had a point that the more radical French Revolution a few years later collapsed into literal terror and ultimately a military dictatorship under Napoleon. By contrast, the United States, over its revolutionary period, remained relatively stable. So maybe the founders were onto something after all. Okay, so factions is our other concept here. We talked about tyranny of the majority, which is this idea that the people will kind of act in a destructive way without a lot of checks. Factions have a similar, if less chaotic, effect than direct democracy. By factions, people like James Madison usually meant a group united by a common interest or a common passion. And today we might say a common belief system. There is some ongoing debate about this, but maybe the most similar modern comparison would be interest groups. In any case, Madison's point is that groups of people will coordinate to achieve power and then impose their interests and prerogatives on everyone else. This is particularly bad because in this process, the faction in power is likely to take away others' rights and act in a narrow self-interest rather than the common good, right? And remember, this idea of acting in the common good is a key idea in that Republican model. The solution for Madison and others to tyranny of the majority for the U.S. founders was to try to keep citizens away from direct elections as much as possible. Now, the solution to factions, according to Madison, was actually the size of the United States itself. By having a republic spread across many areas, economic interests and political, as well as religious beliefs, these factions would check one another to prevent any one of them from taking power. So Madison said our system of checks and balances plus a very broad, spread out country will mean no one of these factions will be able to easily take control of the entire system. Unfortunately, neither Madison nor most of the U.S. founders envisioned political parties dominating the political process. So even as they themselves fell into party politics a few years later, but that is yet another story to discuss for another podcast, I think.
It definitely is. Going a little bit off script here, I was going to say that James Madison fellow was a thinker. I mean, talking about thinkers, did you guys check out the episode on founding documents where we talk about George Mason and Thomas Paine? Man, listen, really, read Common Sense. Put it through Google or Gemini or something and modernize it and find out why it went viral back in 1776. That guy had some really unhinged ways of saying stuff. Back to the idea at hand here. So, how does the United States function today as a constitutional republic with its American style of democracy? Well, because we elect people to represent us. We use democratic voting to choose our representatives, then trust those individuals to represent our interests within the boundaries of the U.S. Constitution. Now, remember, the U.S. Constitution is the supreme law of the land. Review Articles 1, 2, and 3 of the U.S. Constitution. That's another episode where we learn about the separation of powers and the three branches of the federal government.
That's right. We do have some exceptions on direct democracy, such as direct voting on ballot initiatives, but those are always at the state level. We never have any direct democracy with the federal government. Remember, when we say democracy, we usually mean the general idea of any system that allows the people to participate in government, elections, and, that sort of thing. A republic or a constitutional republic are forms of democracy in which we, the people, vote for our representatives, who themselves are constrained by the written rules of the Constitution. By contrast, a direct democracy involves all citizens participating on the ground in nearly all decisions, or even being randomly selected to serve in government rather than be elected. All forms of democracy assume that the people will be actively engaged, informed, and committed on some level to the common good, not just their own specific interests. If they can't do that, the system, our system, starts to break down. So whether he said it exactly that way or not, Ben Franklin was right. It's a republic if you can keep it.
Let's review. Just as Dr. Shively said, as the story goes, when leaving the Constitutional Convention in 1787, Benjamin Franklin was asked what kind of government the framers had created for this new nation. His famous reply was a republic, if you can keep it. The takeaway? The framers didn't hand us a self-sustaining machine. A constitutional republic requires active, civically literate citizens to survive. Number 2, the Guarantee Clause, Article 4, Section 4. The takeaway? Article 4, Section 4 of the U.S. Constitution explicitly guarantees every state a Republican form of government. In exam terms, Republican doesn't mean political party. It means a system where power is held by the people and exercised through elected representatives. Number 3, our ancient roots, Athens and Rome. The framers didn't reinvent the wheel. They looked at classical history to see what worked and what didn't. We get the idea of democracy from the Greeks and the idea of a republic from Rome. Number 4, know the difference between a pure democracy and a constitutional republic. This is a major target on the FCLE. Do not use these terms interchangeably on test day. Number 5, how does our American government function today? We use democratic voting to choose our representatives who then govern within the strict legal boundaries set by the supreme law of the land, the U.S. Constitution. That's a wrap on our review, and that's all for this episode of FCLE Seminar. If you got thoughts on these systems of government or have something you'd like to share, then hey, hit us up in the comments. You can find us on Spotify, Apple, or YouTube. Until then, keep questioning, keep learning, and stay curious. This is your host, Mercedes Musto.
And Jacob Shively, signing off.